Summer's getting super. Play it loud. Hello and welcome to Same Name, Different Game. My name is Joe and I'm your host. This is the beginning of the Super Summer. That's right, it has been 25 years this August that the Super Nintendo Entertainment System launched in the United States, and in celebration we will be spending the summer talking about nothing but things related to the Super NES. So let's dive right in with a little, a lot of history on Nintendo's much-loved 16-bit machine. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System was of course the successor to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo announced the Japanese version, the Super Famicom, in 1989, and reports began to make their way into US gaming magazines as early as EGM number 1. EGM stated that the continued success of the NES would cause Nintendo to hold off releasing the successor. And while that may or may not have been true, the system launched in Japan in 1990, and US magazines started importing them immediately and reporting on the games. Nintendo fans were salivating to get their hands on this system. The hype was out of control. It's the first time I remember being excited for a new video game console, and I was really excited. I wanted to get my hands on this thing and see firsthand what it could do. And it turns out I didn't have to wait long. According to EGM issue number 28, the first Super Nintendo systems hit US shores on August 23rd, 1991. Now this date is a matter of some dispute, with Stephen Kent's Ultimate History of Video Games stating that the actual day was September 9th, 1991. But given that EGM is a source from the time, I'm inclined to believe them. The Electronic Gaming Monthly also proclaimed that a new era has dawned on the video game hobby. And they were right. The games available at launch were F-Zero, Pilot Wings, SimCity, Gradius 3, and packed in with every Super NES, Super Mario World. The system was the most mainstream upgrade to ever hit the market. Sure, the Genesis was technically an upgrade, but the Master System's market share is so limited in North America, a lot of people here didn't know that. The Atari 5200 was basically dead on arrival. The attention the Super NES got? Well, it was enough to make some parents outraged at the very idea of an upgrade. Just look at this news report from 1991.
I'm going to say no, and I'm going to explain to him how people market things to make you spend more money.
But that didn't hold the Super Nintendo back. The system was a smash, moving almost 50 million units worldwide, with a US library of over 700 games when all was said and done. It also marked the dawn of the 16-bit war, which saw the Genesis and Super Nintendo go head-to-head in the US market. Yes, a time fondly remembered for arguing on the playground which was better. The 16-bit era is often thought of as the most nostalgic period for game players of my age. But we're not really talking about the bit wars in this episode. We'll save that for later. We're talking about the transition from NES to Super NES, and now you've heard me talk a lot about post-Super NES NES games and how they didn't really get as much love as games from when the NES was the only game in town, no pun intended. And that's all true. once the Super NES hit, it seemed like players, stores, and magazines just didn't care as much about the old gray box. But it did persist until 1994. And in fact, today's episode is about the final official NES release, Wario's Woods. Wario's Woods is a 1994 game whose history is a bit murky. It's clear that it was designed by Kenji Miki, but Miki worked with Nintendo EAD, the folks behind Super Mario Bros. And Zelda, and Nintendo R&D 2, the folks who worked primarily with hardware and porting inside of Nintendo, but who also made a small handful of games themselves. The credits also list a handful of people from Intelligent Systems, a Nintendo second-party studio who had a hand in games ranging from Metroid on the NES all the way up to Fire Emblem Awakening on the 3DS. Some sources also credit Nintendo R&D 1, but I could find no evidence to back up that claim. Japanese game development in the 80s and 90s, when figuring out who actually worked on a video game requires a Warren Commission-esque investigation. So, Wario's Woods was released for the Super NES and NES in December of 1994. Some sources even go so far as to pin the date as my 12th birthday, but US release dates in that era are notoriously dubious, so I would take that with a grain of salt. Now, as I said, this is the final licensed NES game released in North America, so it's also the only one that has an ESRB rating, right here. The only cartridge with an ESRB rating on it, and that rating is K through A for kids to adults. If that's a rating you don't recognize, it's because it was phased out in 1998 in favor of the much less cumbersome E for everyone. The game is essentially an attempt to merge a character-driven puzzle game like Krusty's Funhouse, for example, with a falling block puzzler like Tetris. Bombs and monsters are dropped from the top of the screen, and the player, as Toad, has to arrange things so that 3 things of the same color, at least one of which is a bomb, are in a row horizontally, vertically, or on an angle. And when that happens, they explode. In the single player, Birdo is typically your, guide, I guess? When she's around, only bombs fall to help Toad, but she's periodically muscled out by Wario, who with the help of his Pidget starts dropping more enemies and lowering the ceiling. When a stage is cleared, you're given coins based on how fast you did it, and if you get enough coins, you get an extra life. As the game progresses, you'll start to see different kinds of monsters. You'll see ones that have to be bombed twice. You'll see ones that have to be bombed twice within a few seconds, and ones that can only be bombed diagonally, not horizontally or vertically. Toad can climb stacks of enemies and bombs, but not when he's holding anything. He can pick up full stacks as long as they don't hit the ceiling. He can pick up single items, and he can stack things, but only a few high. Once things are more than 2 units taller than him, he can't stack anymore. He can pick up full stacks, then put them down 1 item at a time. He can kick items that are next to him, and he can warp to the top of the stack if he's carrying it, putting it down right where he's standing. Does all of that sound really complicated? Because that's the #1 problem with Wario's Woods. And the Super NES maps all that stuff to different buttons, and it gets pretty tough to keep track of. For a simple puzzle game, this is a really complicated control scheme, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. Reviews at the time said the same thing. Puzzle games are often addictive because of their simplicity. Think about all the really successful puzzle games over the years. Tetris is literally putting falling bricks into lines. Candy Crush is as easy as swapping things next to each other to match colors. The ambition of Wario's Woods is a hindrance in the end. For a company that's historically made things relatively easy, it's weird to see a puzzle game of this vintage have one of the first in-game tutorials that I can think of. And that's a big whiff on Nintendo's part. This is the same company that brought us Tetris and Dr. Mario. Straightforward puzzle games with easy to understand concepts that are difficult to master, and easy control schemes. Also, once you finally fully understand the controls of Wario's Woods, the game itself has become a little tedious, to be honest. But I don't want to spend the whole video bagging on this game. Let's talk about the differences. The biggest difference is the modes. Each version has an exclusive mode. The Super NES version has a versus CPU single-player mode. The problem is that it's really frustrating. The CPU is much better at this game than the average human, even the first couple of opponents. I struggled to beat the third CPU player. The NES version has an A and B mode in the single player. The B mode adds boss fights. The boss is in the well with you, and you have to get bombs to blow up next to the boss by stacking monsters near them. This is incredibly frustrating since the bosses move around as you're trying to line things up. The final major difference is that in the normal single-player mode, on the NES you spend the entire time in the titular woods, while on the Super NES version you get a map screen, and as you progress, you get into different areas which provide different backgrounds. The main game, the two-player mode, and the time trial are identical in both versions. But what this game does a really good job at is illustrating the difference in capabilities between the Super NES and the NES in terms of graphics and sound. The NES had a usable color palette of 54 colors. By contrast, the Super NES had a usable color palette of 32,768 colors. And the same goes for the sound chip. Now I love the NES sound chip and the sounds that it produces, and some of those songs are great, classic earworms, but the Super NES sound chip, manufactured by Sony and designed by Ken Kutaragi, yes, that Ken Kutaragi, father of the PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, is capable of so much more. So let's take a look and a listen, just like everybody was doing in the early 90s, and compare side by side the Super NES and the NES. The Super NES game is certainly more pleasing in both categories, though I don't honestly think the soundtrack is that much to write home about on either system. Graphically, the game really shows off how much more cartoon-like and colorful the Super NES allowed games to be. It's a perfect side-by-side to illustrate the visual potential of the system over its predecessor. And that makes it time to give the edge. Now, I will be honest, for me, neither one of these games really pushed my buttons, but a lot of people dig this game. You know, I just gotta say, at a time when Kirby's Avalanche, Tetris Attack, and Dr. Mario were available, I just don't really see the draw of this one. But, like I said, some people really dig it, so don't take my word for it. I will say that the NES version definitely was more playable for me personally. The streamlined control scheme really worked out for me better than the complicated controls of the Super NES version. Also, this is the only version available on Virtual Console, which I think is a little strange, but if you want your Wario's Woods fix on Virtual Console, this one is available for the Wii, Wii U, and the 3DS, while the Super NES version is not available on any of those services, which again, a little strange. But that does it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and come back next month because the Super Summer continues apace, and we will be looking at third-party support and trans-Pacific changes. You won't want to miss it. See you then.
The Freeze, Mr. Crowley! Today!
Think that's pressure? Try Wario's Woods, the new action puzzle where stuff's hurling down on you, in on you, and Wario is all over you. Only for Nintendo. Think that's pressure? Try Wario's Woods, the new action puzzle with falling bombs to stack, critters to whack, and Wario at your back. Only for Nintendo.